I want to take up tonight how we can understand and how we filter the barrage of media that's increasingly, in an increasingly complex and interconnected world, where there is a crisis a minute that literally vies for our attention and our response. In the U.S., we face a police murder every day, and each more outrageous than the next. Tens of thousands of police attacks where people are maimed and disabled, and millions in U.S. prisons. Now, U.S. war crimes around the world are in even greater numbers every day and every hour, but far more confusing because they're robbed of history, robbed of context. They come with a barrage of justification, of demonization, and a great deal that's not reported. So how do we orient the party and the movement that is fighting for change? And this is where Lenin is still an anchor. So I'm going to deal with three developments and their kind of common link tonight. It's titled Setbacks and War Crimes Expose U.S. Desperation in Afghanistan, Syria, and Palestine. Now, the basis of Leninism is to recognize the responsibility of the workers' movements in the imperialist countries to always oppose their own ruling class. Otherwise, just lost, drowned in the media hype and the layers of propaganda, of chauvinism, of racist, imperialist nationalism. And this is also where Sam Marcy made really his earliest defining thesis, the basis of workers' world today, in a document called The Global Class War. It's the most difficult question here in the center of imperialism, the center of the military machine. And it is so interlinked with racism and national oppression, as the class struggle always is. You can't think of one without the other. The most powerful empire does not just serve Wall Street's corporate interests with a powerful military machine. The most powerful in history, 1,000 bases around the world in 130 countries, Trident submarine that in one launch could destroy life on the planet. We could go on with the power, the weight of the U.S. military machine. It's meant to create fear and to set an example and say that their rule can't be challenged. But it also operates with U.S. politicians that are fully vetted to be first and foremost loyal to U.S. corporate power. And that is true whether it is Bernie Sanders saying he's a socialist or Donald Trump, an arch racist and reactionary. And it's true from Bush to Obama. So the politicians play a very important role because they speak from different directions, but their message isn't much different, and each of them are pretty carefully vetted on the essential question. U.S. empire also operates with a media whose role is to demonize whoever the U.S. is targeting. The role is to frame the discussion with endless talking heads. They literally take all the air, it seems, out of circulation at times. It's just saturated with the bias and the bigotry. And they also operate with their imperialist allies in the European Union, Japan, the G7 as it's called, the NATO military alliance, with their proxies that absolutely include Israel and Saudi Arabia, who could not survive 1 minute without U.S. military equipment and without the political and diplomatic cover. So all of that is part of U.S. imperialist rule. It's ABC. It's one war. It's not a whole series of wars. We really have to think of it as one war on the world. Different fronts, a global war, a war at home with increased racism and austerity, and a war abroad with endless racism and reaction. And we take sides in the war because Workers' World is a combat organization. One side is always against U.S. imperialism, the ruling class right here. And it's like, think about it as a compass. Always points north. doesn't go all over the map, it always points north. And that's how we have to think of ourselves, like a compass. We're always going to direct the discussion back to U.S. imperialism. Who's the enemy? What is behind this? There's a compass coming back again and again. And it's not repetitive. You don't say, oh, this is a repetitive compass. It's always saying the same thing. No, you say it's always pointing true north. Then it is a valuable, useful instrument. Now, how does the U.S. empire keep all this together? It's increasingly difficult. It needs more war, and more endless wars, and institutions built for war. At a time when it no longer has a productive capacity, at a time when it's bloated and decaying and losing the ability to enforce its will, and at a time when the world increasingly talks to each other and where there's instant communication. The gap between rich and poor greater than any time in world history. So how do they hide this gap? Every war is first preceded by a big media blitz. It's desperate people fleeing or weapons of mass destruction that put the world at risk. It's a massive effort to create fear, fear, fear. And also a constant theme that runs through all the media and every talking head is we must do something. That something is left unsaid for a while, but we must do something. What are we going to do? Now, we does not include us, let's just say. It includes the U.S. military machine, but it's always posed as we must do something, and they pummel the population with it. International forums, they absolutely take over. We must do something. In the lead up to this UN International Summit on Development Sustainability, the UN General Assembly in September, all the media was focused on the refugee crisis in Syria and the tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. Suddenly, actually, all refugees from North Africa to Central Asia were labeled as Syrian refugees. Why was that? Why were all the other war refugees suddenly off the agenda and everyone was a Syrian refugee? The war in Syria is in its fourth year. It has ground on and left half the population displaced. That is a ruin on one of the most modern, developed of the Arab countries. Highest rates of literacy, of health care, modern infrastructure, and literally destroyed by tens of thousands of mercenaries. Religious mercenaries, yes, but they are paid and equipped by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, by Jordan, coordinated by the U.S. Now, the New York Times just today had a very interesting article on NATO that really exposed the anger at Russia for its steps, but also exposed the reason for the massive publicity on the refugee crisis and the we must do something mood that it was created. Said that Russian assistance to Syria had closed off Western options. That's very interesting. Said that the flow of refugees was breaking down the resistance in Europe to NATO strikes to set up no-fly zones in Syria. The refugee crisis had been focusing the resolve in European minds to solve the problem with no-fly zones. That's very interesting. And it does show you why the enormous amount of publicity is not that the refugees weren't coming in great numbers from all the U.S. wars, but the images, the child on the beach, the family, the rubber dinghies that sink, we could go on and on. We've all seen those images that just pull. Why were they on the front pages? Because that exists every day. But it was, as it says, to break down the resistance in Europe to do something, create a no-fly zone in Syria. So the no-fly zones, and this was a pretext, remember, that Washington used in Libya, 7 months of bombing that left the entire country a smoking ruin, a population destitute, Almost half the population of Libya today are refugees living in Tunisia, and others trying desperately to reach Europe. So they wanted to do the same thing in Syria. They had also found a way back into bombing ISIL, Daesh as it's called, the Islamic State. They describe the enemy of all humankind. While at the same time, it was the U.S. who was, I say, coordinating with Saudi Arabia and Turkey to build this reactionary fanatical force. So they were bombing, but they seemed unable to hit the truck convoys taking supplies in, the truck convoys taking oil out, the huge tank concentrations, or any of the other things that are even available on satellite imagery. Now the zones, the no-fly zones that they wanted to create in Syria, it was supposed to create an area where a U.S. opposition army, this moderate army they keep talking about that they want to create, you know, the moderates, and they keep saying, well, the moderates keep turning their weapons over to al-Nusra and whatnot. But they wanted to create a zone where these moderate opposition forces would be based, along with tens of thousands of Syrian refugees who would be trucked back and dumped in this protected zone. That was really the plan of the no-fly zone. But now, the presence of Russian planes and equipment, and this is the New York Times describing the presence of Russian planes and equipment makes setting up a no-fly zone almost impossible. Now, that's a big setback. And it does show that everything does not go according to their plans, and that their plans are based on both propaganda, political pressure, but they can't always be carried out. Now, I've been asked on all kinds, and everybody is sort of saying, well, why can't, this is what the commentators ask, why can't, if the U.S. is for bombing ISIS, and so is Russia, why can't they cooperate with each other? See, they have two totally different aims. The real goal of the U.S. in Syria is to overthrow the Syrian government and set up a completely complicit state. Total collaborators. It's not to do anything healthy or progressive. And the purpose of the Russian assistance in Syria is to save the sovereignty of Syria and to stop a complete takeover. So you have two totally different agendas now that are checking each other. And also a significant increase in military weaponry into the region. So it's not the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination. The biggest rebuke, by the way, came when there was President Obama, there was Putin speaking at the UN General Assembly, and on that morning came the announcement that there would be an agreement of military cooperation between Russia, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. Now, the U.S. was absolutely, this took them totally by surprise. At least so they say, they were not expecting it. This was a government they had put in place. So you ask yourself, how could that happen? But here's a problem that even a completely collaborative Iraqi government faces. They know the real U.S. plan is to break Iraq into little pieces, to do what was done to the Yugoslav Federation, to make microstates. And so that pressure within Iraq by all different forces who still are determined to keep a unified state pushes them into an alliance that they may not have thought about before, because there are now other options. But it certainly has completely enraged the U.S. Now, I want to say also something very important in terms of Palestine, which is off the news, and there's hardly coverage of the struggle that is going on in Palestine at a whole new level today, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. In essence, Israel has been given a blank check to hit Palestine hard. And they've also been given some very advanced new military weaponry. It's kind of the payoff on the Iran deal. They're going to supposedly placate Israel as if Israel could exist a minute, a heartbeat, without U.S. equipment for more than 6 decades. But it does give Israel a whole new launch in their repression, which is now extensive. There were demonstrations called Day of Rage last Tuesday. International Action Center helped build this demonstration, spread the word. Because solidarity with Palestine, even if it's not in the media at that immediate time, always has to be at the top of our agenda. We really always have to keep it up there. And there are comrades here and good friends who have helped make that possible over decades, and we just want to always take notice of that. The world movement is increasingly, solidarity with Palestine is now just a given. That is very much a part of life and understood, a very different thing than a few decades ago, where those who would support and defend Palestine were a handful. Now it's overwhelmingly true. It's overwhelmingly true also, especially on campuses, among young people, and the population as a whole. And it's Israel that is increasingly isolated and desperate and still unable to break Palestinian resistance. This is a crime that goes back to the Nakba, to the driving out of the Palestinians in 1948. And the ensuing occupation, the Israeli state, its settler apparatus, has demonstrated a desire not only to deny Palestinian statehood, but its intention to completely annihilate the Palestinian people. And they do this through the expansion of settlements, mass expulsions, periodic massacres, and all with complete compliance from the U.S. empire. So I thought that was important, because we always want to make that connection from the first crime to it going all the way through, and always also want to base it on the role of U.S. imperialism, without which this crime could not continue. But we want to also always salute the continuing resistance of the Palestinian people. They called a general strike as part of the Day of Rage. And it was in effect in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. They reestablished popular committees, organizing self-defense networks throughout the West Bank, and put out the call for international solidarity. So we want to be much more alert on this in the days ahead. We want to at the same time know that Israel again is carrying out bombings, absolute massacres in Gaza. And the toll, just when you see it, 8 killed here, 9 killed this day, 6, you can just see the numbers ratcheting up. So we want to always keep solidarity with Palestine on our agenda, and also keep it rooted in the real cause. Now, I next wanted to bring up Afghanistan, the longest U.S. war against the country that is the poorest country in the world, and where a major city in Afghanistan just fell to the Taliban, who, how many times in the last 14 years have we heard, was absolutely defeated and lost and so on. There was an important article in Workers' World by John Catalanato, which described the U.S. airstrikes that targeted and destroyed a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And at the time, 10 patients, 12 healthcare providers were reported killed. And this was a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders. And they have since decided that they are leaving Kunduz because their own security couldn't be guaranteed. Now that is really, and what this article raised, an increasing number of voices, including Doctors Without Borders, Medicine Sin Frontieres itself. That may have been the purpose of the bombing, to get rid of any Western observers, any who are there on a humanitarian mission, because a much worse massacre is being planned. So closing the hospital is the first step, and directly firing on the operating room and the pharmacy and the emergency rooms. There are 24 that are still missing and presumed dead. We could connect this back, it's 14 years ago, October 2001, when U.S. planes destroyed the Red Cross complex in Kabul. So it's not the first time they're hitting a medical complex. They actually hit that complex twice, even though it was absolutely clearly marked. It's in all the coordinates, and medical facilities everywhere in the world. You can even see the huge Red Cross, Red Crescent markings on the rooftops. They're very, very well known. It's impossible to mistake it. And that was what the statement from Médecins Sin Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, said. This is not an accident. We called for an hour and a half telling you to stop. It wasn't just one strike. It was again and again and again, coming back and coming back and coming back. And the U.S. officials keep changing their story about what happened, why they hit the hospital. But it's little doubt from all of this that it was on purpose. Here's a statement from them. It says, Médecins Sin Frontières is disgusted by the recent statements coming from some of the Afghan government officials justifying the attack on its hospital in Kunduz. These statements imply that Afghan and U.S. forces working together decided to raze to the ground a fully functioning hospital with more than 180 staff and patients inside because they claimed that members of the Taliban were present. This amounts to an admission of a war crime. It utterly contradicts the initial attempts of the U.S. government to minimize the attacks as collateral damage. So they're not just taking, as a matter of fact, President Obama called to apologize. They didn't accept it. They said, we received the apology. They went out of their way not to say, we accept the apology. It's not the first war crime in Afghanistan. It's the way the U.S. fights its wars. And since the 1979 Afghanistan, the first U.S. war in Afghanistan, it has carried out multiple, again and again, war crimes, but war crimes that are particularly aimed at the infrastructure and at making sure that there's no one there to challenge the next crimes. The term collateral damage, that was a term that was first used in the U.S. war and bombing of Yugoslavia. And they used it again and again, very cavalierly, collateral damage. It meant hitting civilian targets, just a byproduct of war. The very cynicism of it. We shouldn't forget, for example, in the U.S. bombing of Yugoslavia, they hit 427 schools and 14 tanks. Those are the U.S. own figures. So you see who was a real target in that war. Now, I just want to make notice, because actually from forces right here, we helped to expose a number of the crimes that were so much a part of past U.S. wars, and that now are being listed sort of all over the internet as the U.S. responsible for past war crimes. So I saw a listing, and it was kind of gripped me. There was a U.S. bombing in Iraq of an infant formula production plant, really used for infant nutrition. It was a visit by Ramsey Clark that through the International Action Center we spread worldwide, going to this plant, showing this is infant formula. There was the air raid shelter at Amaria in Iraq, where literally hundreds of children and women. It was an air raid shelter. There were no fighters in that shelter. There were families, and it was intentionally incinerated. It was targeted. And we visited this in each of the trips to Iraq. It was still a terrible, terrible visit. 2,000-pound laser bombs just destroyed all life in that shelter. There was the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, Sudan. We had a delegation that went to that pharmaceutical plant. We saw firsthand that this was the most important facility in Sudan. It produced anti-malaria, small medicines, veterinary medicines, and medicines for TB. I can remember picking up the little bottles and vials in this small facility made of cinder block, not a nerve gas facility, as it was described at the time. There was a bombing of a train in Serbia. I can remember visiting this young woman, about 10 years old, who was a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down, because that train she was on was bombed with anti-personnel weapons that had sliced her spinal cord. I can remember visiting the radio and television station in Serbia that was bombed, and it's all often, by the way, the media centers that are bombed. The Al Jazeera center that was bombed as the U.S. occupation came in again, and it was bombed again, and then the Palestine hotel was bombed where all the journalists were staying. There were Reuters journalists who was shot standing right on the balcony. That was an attempt to say to the journalists, get out. This is the first step of occupation, is terror against any who would challenge the official story. The London Mirror exposed a very interesting tape between, at the time, Tony Blair and George Bush, where Bush wanted to bomb the Al Jazeera station in Qatar because they had coverage of what the U.S. was doing in Fallujah. That was in 2005. So it shows their mentality is, if you're going to speak the truth, we want to destroy you. And we want to do it in a way that terrorizes you. That attack didn't happen, but it does show the way their minds work. So, just in conclusion, I want to say we want to never accept any excuse for U.S. war. We want to always stand with the oppressed who are under attack, and to recognize that every one of these wars, part of the class struggle, where both the nationally oppressed are on one side and those who are determined to rule on the other. But their hands are slipping with terrible blood. They've left smoking ruin of whole countries, but we also want to know that they're not succeeding. There's real resistance. And the ability of the people in Syria, the ability of the people in Palestine, the ability of people around the world to hold on and to continue to resist, and the ability of us right here to show international solidarity, these are the things that are decisive. Some really excellent questions. I hope I have time. But before I answer any of the questions, I really want to go back to, when we're talking about resistance, we really need to include what is happening in Yemen right now. This is amazing, incredible, and is creating an absolute crisis for Saudi Arabia. And not one Saudi plane can fly without the U.S. handlers processing it. I mean, they have no independent air force. The ground crews, the satellite reconnaissance, the targeting is all done by the U.S. But it's called a Saudi bombing of Yemen. It is an effort to absolutely crush resistance in what is the poorest country of the Arab world. And yet it's not succeeding, and there have been very important strikes even within Saudi Arabia now. And there's enormous ferment in Saudi Arabia, because, just to raise one point, for example, the Shia population of Saudi Arabia have no rights whatsoever, including even the right of citizenship, no right to their own schools or religious services or anything. They're like non-people. So that's a real basis of and they're the poorest and often crucial oil workers. That's within Saudi Arabia. But in Yemen, where you see the Ansarullah movement has welded together many forces within Yemen. So if we're talking about the region, I just want to make sure that we really also talk about this resistance. And Saudi Arabia thought it would take 2 weeks, would be all over, and that's not the way it's gone. And that was originally the prediction on Syria, that there would be regime change, the government would collapse, the U.S. could roll in 2 weeks. You remember that? And then it was going to be a month, and then, within 2 months, and so on. So we can never expect, they always go into the war with a huge hype. Now, Russia's assistance to the sovereign country of Syria. And Syria, as a sovereign country in international law, has every right to ask for assistance and every right for it to be given, whether it is from Iran, from Hezbollah, or from Russia, or any other country. They didn't request it from the U.S. The U.S. declared they were going to bomb in Syria and in Iraq. We could ask, why did Russia do this? There has been a real change. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a real capitalist restoration in Russia. And there were many, including the whole ruling group, who assumed that they could be part of, and they joined the G8 with big fanfare. They could be part of the club. And they didn't understand that, no, they were supposed to be the main course. You know, and that was like a real surprise. That NATO, which was pledged, Secretary of State Baker, NATO, if the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. And instead, it rolled into every country of Eastern Europe and also former parts of the Soviet Union. So that was a wake-up call, that right to the very borders of Russia. But the real change came with Ukraine, the coup in Ukraine, the fascist coup that overturned an elected government. We could say it was corrupt, but for anyone in the U.S. to talk about corruption, I mean, for heaven's sakes. It was really a fascist coup, and it was an effort to bring Ukraine into NATO, and also to seize hold of Russia's one warm water port in the Crimea. And they were shocked when Putin and Russian forces went in and simply secured their own base in Crimea. More shocked, though, when there was resistance, people's resistance, in East Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now that changed it even more than what Putin did in Crimea. And so we want to know, you know, there's the changes that come from below, and there's the changes that come with assistance. Now, it has been decisive and important in East Ukraine that there was Russian assistance. But that's not the first step. The most industrialized part of the Ukraine refused to accept a fascist takeover in the government, and people organized themselves and armed themselves and pushed the fascists back and out of East Ukraine. And it's a struggle going on right now, and the response has been a more and more of a NATO mobilization. So we really want to keep in mind what is pushing Russia right now. They know, Iran knows, everyone in the region knows that a complete overturn in Syria would mean chaos in the entire region. They all know that Syria and Iran were on the hit list from 2001. Remember that famous statement by General Wesley Clark of another general showing him the memo. He says there's 7 countries on this hit list that are going to be hit in the next 5 years. Named them. You know, Afghanistan, but also Iraq and Syria and Iran and Sudan and Yemen. So, at any rate, it's a growing awareness that that is. It's a growing awareness as to whose very survival is at stake. And just as Iraq, really a government set up by the U.S., would suddenly join in this alliance that the U.S. isn't happy with at all, that is also, Russia is a capitalist country. And the U.S. still wants them to make a deal. That was the purpose of imposing the sanctions. They felt, well, if the pain is great enough, those business people who want their profits above all else will push Putin out. But they also may have understood their own survival is at stake. But those are the kind of pressures that are at play. And we have to know, in terms of, we defend international solidarity, but we also do recognize that this is a big political change. Now, How will China come into this? There was all kinds of news last week, even announcements that there was a Chinese aircraft carrier or Chinese ships that had come through the Suez Canal and that were going to stand with Syria. And then other news coverage that said this has not been confirmed. So we don't know. China did issue a statement that seemed much more directed against the U.S. Everyone should stand out of affairs in Syria. So it doesn't mean that they're sending in equipment. It doesn't mean they're sending in any forces. But we don't know, because who would have expected the Russian assistance? Who would have expected earlier that Hezbollah would come into this, or that Iran would come into this? It was an important, actually, Iranian general who was killed today. So this is a struggle on the ground, in the air. There are some cruise missiles that Russia fired from the Crimea that hit an ISIS target in Syria. So it's a war that also could still expand. Two of the questions dealt with Yugoslavia and the U.S. war in Yugoslavia. And just to say that when the U.S. breaks up a country, and we've seen the huge migration, what U.S. wars did in El Salvador, in Central America. But what the U.S. war did in Yugoslavia, a war really to break up this country into little pieces. There were 8 republics that made up the Yugoslav Federation into a very prosperous country, broken up into little pieces. And no one country can connect with each other. All connection is through Berlin and London, Washington, whatnot. The simplest post letter for years couldn't go between, it's like you couldn't contact New Jersey. It was such an ironclad breakup. All the people of the region have been impoverished by this. This war that was supposedly to save Kosovo, more than half of the young people of Kosovo, Albanian, who the U.S. said they were there to save, have left. They're part of the migration, many of them living here in the Bronx, Germany, many other countries, because there's no future. The industries were completely gutted. There's no way that people can stay and have a life. So even those forces in Bosnia and Kosovo who thought if they sided with the U.S., they would get a better deal, they've gotten a terrible deal. Now, taking President Milosevic to The Hague, that's very important in terms of U.S. legality. It's never the war criminals. That's why we've held tribunal after tribunal to say, let's put the real war criminals on trial. But they want to always turn it on their head and make the victim the villain. And the rewriting and writing of history is extremely important to the ruling class. So the International Criminal Court has, since it was established, only put African countries in the Hague. Brought them, they're supposedly the war criminals, not the very countries that have looted Africa, not the countries that owe Africa reparations. No, instead they brought one leader after another, or charged them, and if they leave their own country, which is true, for example, in the Sudan, to go to a conference in South Africa, suddenly there's a warrant to drag to The Hague. Now, Milosevic and the forces in Yugoslavia, they set up a special tribunal. It wasn't part of the International Criminal Court. It was a special tribunal on the crimes supposedly committed in Yugoslavia. Of course, never charged the U.S. The only people who could be charged had to be from Yugoslavia. That's how they got around it. Germany wasn't to blame, U.S. wasn't to blame, NATO bombers weren't to blame. Bill Clinton wasn't to blame. Those who were really guilty weren't to blame. I went to visit President Milosevic at The Hague when he was in prison there, and it was you go through layers and layers and layers of that jail, and he was kept in pretty strong isolation, and his records had been taken away from him. He had a book that we published called, the Hidden Agenda, U.S. Takeover of Yugoslavia.
That was awful.
Yes, it was a book that we published. We also later published his statement, President Milosevic's statement to The Hague, called The Defense Speaks. But we published quite a thick book based on the War Crimes Tribunal we held. And the reason it was important was his own documents and papers had been taken from him. And yet he wanted to present a defense in terms of what was done to Yugoslavia. He knew he had no chance of ever seeing the light of day again. But he wanted to present what had been done to Yugoslavia. And what he had there was the book that we had published that listed the name of every school of the 427 that had been bombed, every hospital, every medical clinic, and had testimony from doctors who'd been there and lawyers who'd been there, and the delegations that we'd sent had firsthand testimony, had photographs, had all kinds of material, had the original aims of the U.S. war stated, had the NATO statements of what they were going to do to Yugoslavia. All that was published in this one book by the International Action Center, a very important book. And you could see it was valuable to him. He went through it page by page. Where's this and where's that? He had yellow stickums on this and folded papers out of that. So we should never ignore what we do here, even around the world. And at the time, people said, how could you defend this absolute monster, this dictator, this and that and the other? We said, well, wait a minute, this was the elected president of Yugoslavia, and they held elections that all the political parties took part in, and he wasn't even the majority. You know, it was a parliamentary procedure. Anyway, but the U.S. effort to bring him there was really an effort always to put the victim on trial, and has been done since Geronimo and Crazy Horse and Native American leaders who were put on trial for resistance. And had Gaddafi survived, that's what they would have wanted to do to him. But instead, a very brutal assassination took place, a horrendous assassination. But that is what anyone who resists U.S. rule, they want to make an example of. In closing, I want to say the importance of just international solidarity based on Henry's talk and the life of Mumia Abu-Jamal, because it is a solidarity that came not only in the U.S. Here was a U.S. political prisoner, and the statements, for example, that came from France, naming streets, having figures from around the world who called for his very life to stop the execution. It shows that we really can be a powerful force. It takes organization. I want to back up what Sue said about signing the latest petition. Sign every one of these petitions. It's just like, should I go to this demonstration or that one? Go to every single one, because the presence there, the statements there, and the online statements, and all of this makes a powerful message that we just should never, never underestimate. When we refuse to allow anyone that the U.S. puts on the dock in trial, in an earlier time, I just want to say, because Teresa went to meet with Noriega, president of Panama, because the U.S. not only overthrew that government, they put him in a jail in solitary in Florida. So it shows from one side of the world to the other. And at the time, people said the same thing. Why, Noriega is so terrible. How could you defend Noriega? I said, the U.S., who made the war, is far worse. And they're demonizing him, not to liberate anyone in Panama, or not to liberate anyone in Yugoslavia, or to liberate anyone in Syria, or any of these countries, but in order to enslave them and to destroy these countries and to make resistance an impossibility. So we do stand with resistance everywhere it exists, and even when it's political programs or political leaders that we might not agree with everything that they say, when the U.S. targets them, then we're clear where we stand, and we say, no, that is not going to be allowed. Thank you.